What was the tragic true story of the hero of Chernobyl? On the 26th of April 1986, a meltdown occurred in the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, almost immediately causing it to explode. The reactor later emitted 400 times more radioactive material than the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Over the following years, thousands would die as a result. 2 years later, in a quiet Moscow apartment, an ex-Soviet chemist attached a rope to the ceiling of his home and stepped up onto a chair. Putting his head through the noose and looking around his room for the last time, the chair fell. In his final days, he recorded evidence proving the Chernobyl disaster was not the result of lack of sleep nor incompetent workers. The disaster was the fault of the Soviet system. His name was Valery Legasov, and he knew that his death would force others to listen. He died so that others didn't have to. In the recent HBO series Chernobyl, Valery Legasov is depicted as a scientist who sacrificed everything in the pursuit of truth. A scientist who disregarded authority and, as a result, saved millions of lives. While the series omits certain aspects of Valery's life and dramatizes others fundamentally regarding his sacrifice, the series is at least mostly historically accurate. Throughout this video, we will briefly discuss the true life of Valery Legasov. Born in September 1936, life would initially be kind to Legasov. Excelling at school, he chose to later study at Mendeleev Moscow Institute of Chemistry and Technology, a university which prepared students for the Soviet nuclear industry. While he was blissfully unaware at the time, this was Legasov's first steps on the path towards his role in the Chernobyl disaster. Later, Legasov became a doctor at 36 and a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences at 45. After receiving numerous awards for his work in inorganic chemistry, it wouldn't be long before Legasov found himself promoted. Later, now the director of Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, he married and had 2 children. Legasov's life was seemingly peaceful. However, this serenity was shattered when in April of 1986, Legasov's phone rang. The call was from the closed-state telephone line, and upon answering, Legasov was notified he had been chosen as the lead scientist in the Chernobyl Commission. This organization was given the responsibility of determining the cause of the disaster and overseeing Chernobyl's cleanup. On paper, Valery Legasov should never have been beckoned to Chernobyl. Valery didn't specialize in nuclear reactors, but rather explosives. However, a scientist was required to join the commission. With Legasov's colleagues unreachable, he was chosen on the basis that he was the only one to pick up the phone. The Soviets had unwittingly chosen a scientist who wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and who was willing to give up his life to expose the truth. Prior to the disaster, Valery had discussed issues regarding the RBM K1000 reactors, the same reactors used within the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Concerned that new safety measures were required to prevent catastrophe, he suggested that a protective shield should encase the reactors, a suggestion which was dismissed by his colleagues. Immediately after the accident, 2 groups began working on the issues presented by the disaster, both groups hindering one another. One of these groups was assembled to determine what had caused the accident, while the other was placed to cover it up. Upon receiving the call, and with no time to consider, Legasov rushed to the airport, where a Soviet private plane was waiting for him. Upon his arrival in Chernobyl, it was Legasov who immediately demanded the evacuation of the neighboring city, Pripyat, unwilling to sacrifice the safety of those around for the reputation of the state. Unafraid to tell Soviet authorities what must be done, Legasov continued to work without rest to limit the suffering caused by the disaster. As the only scientist, Valery found himself surrounded by Soviet politicians, who were often working against him and were initially unaware of the dangers of radiation. However, Legasov focused on his task, disregarding the increasing dose of radiation he was receiving, a dose which as a scientist he knew would sooner or later be fatal. Legasov's daughter would later state, he understood quite well what he was doing and how much radiation he was being exposed to. After the initial explosion, without further action, the worst was yet to come. Without response, Chernobyl would have continued to emit nuclear radiation, which would have cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Working beside Chernobyl's open reactor, an endless source of ionizing radiation, almost every scientific decision which prevented further disaster came through Legasov. Valery determined it was essential to pour 5,000 tons of lead, boron, sand, and dolomite onto the reactor, mitigating the risk of further catastrophe. Had this not been done, the scientists feared that this could cause an explosion. Years later, more gloomy experts postulated that this could have irradiated much of Eastern Europe, leaving entire swathes of the continent uninhabitable. Shortly after the accident, experts determined that workers must, at the very most, spend 2 weeks on the site. However, Legasov spent a total of 4 months working beside the open reactor core. As a result, on the 5th of May, less than 2 weeks after the disaster began, Valery started experiencing the effects of radiation sickness. This resulted in hair loss, coughing, sickness, and insomnia. But Legasov continued to work day and night to limit the ever-rising death toll. While only a few realized at the time, the disaster was completely preventable. However, unfortunately, the only ones who knew this had either been silenced or had no intention of exposing the issue. The nuclear catastrophe was inevitable and entirely the fault of the design defects covered up by the Soviet system. Built within the Soviet RBMK nuclear reactors was the AZ-5 button. This button was designed to prevent a nuclear meltdown in the case of emergency. However, before the disaster, it had been discovered that, in certain circumstances, the AZ-5 button caused the opposite effect. Upon pressing the AZ-5 button, all control rods, which had previously been withdrawn, were reinserted. This was designed to reduce reactivity. However, at the end of each control rod was a graphite neutron moderator, and graphite increases reactivity. As a result, upon the introduction of the control rods, there was a sudden and unexpected spike in power, causing the explosion. It was 3 years earlier, in 1983, that the defect had been discovered, and from then until the Chernobyl disaster, this fundamental flaw had been covered up. The Soviet state, who were worried more by their reputation than the safety of their citizens, had ignored this revelation. Any dissenters of this narrative were dealt with extremely harshly. Fate would eventually leave Legasov with an ultimatum. He could either sacrifice all he had and expose the faults of the Soviet state, or live with the knowledge that at any moment another nuclear disaster may occur. Later, in Vienna, Legasov was chosen by Soviet leader Gorbachev to present the details of the catastrophe to the international scientific and political community. However, unexpectedly, Valery exposed the state's responsibilities for the disaster. He revealed that fundamentally the explosion was catalyzed by the reactor's design flaws. Abroad, Legasov was named Person of the Year and listed among the top 10 scientists in the world. However, on Soviet soil, Valery was deemed a traitor. The state was embarrassed that their reactors had been proven flawed and blamed Valery. Upon returning from Vienna, Valery found himself shunned and sidelined by his colleagues and surrounding community. Later, Valery's name was allegedly crossed off the list of those to be awarded for their response at Chernobyl by none other than the Soviet leader Gorbachev. Struggling with his resulting isolation, Valery soon became depressed. His depression was compounded by the Soviets' continuing lack of consideration for safety regarding their remaining nuclear reactors. Over time, overwhelmed with grief and suffering from radiation sickness, Legasov struggled to sleep or eat. Concerned that his suffering would become a burden and determined to expose the shortcomings of the Soviet state, Valery Legasov committed suicide on the 27th of April 1988, the day after the 2-year anniversary of Chernobyl. Legasov, after witnessing the suffering caused by Chernobyl, took his own life so that he could no longer be ignored. 8 years later, he would be awarded as a hero of the Russian Federation for courage and heroism. The lies of the Soviets had blinded them. In their desperation to prove their dominance, eventually they had become victims of their own propaganda. They knowingly ignored danger that later cost them an estimated $68 billion, and more importantly, thousands of lives. Later, ex-Soviet leader Gorbachev wrote, "The nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl 20 years ago this month, even more so than my launch of Perestroika, was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union."